This is not the persecution of beginners who, at the first disagreement, will pretend to be victims and take path of activism. But this is a persecution of non-violent veterans who will bear the consequences of their choice without protest, who will spread around them what they carry inside themselves, and that is peace and friendship. Their willingness to bear suffering and absorb injustice has the potential to inspire all who have come in contact with them. Welcome back to my channel. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This is the 8th penultimate beatitude, which in the second part, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, is completely identical to the first beatitude, and together they form a sandwich, marking the beginning and the end of the paradigm shift process. However, this one and the last beatitude are not dealing with the process of the paradigm shift, nor with the person who is undergoing this process, but only with the violent reaction of the system to the presence of peacemakers. Again, we have a paradox that the presence of peacemakers provokes a conflict. This can be confusing to peacemakers as they are unaware of how they have become dangerous to the system. The last two beatitudes describe two levels of persecution, by political and by religious systems. And in this beatitude, we are going to deal with political persecution. The political system of control perceives peacemakers as danger to a system. Not because the peacemakers meddle in politics or because they have become dangerous to other citizens, but because the system of control and the kingdom of God are based on two completely opposite principles. This is mentioned in many places. For example, Jesus says, "If you were of the world would love its own. Yet because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you." The kingdom of God is based on principles of love and freedom. The paradigm shift transforms people into peacemakers who build peace on the principles of love and freedom, that is, on righteousness. On the other hand, the political system rests entirely on the principles of fear and security. This is described in the book Leviathan by the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes. Observing the internal state of self-willed people, Hobbes concluded that man's autonomy, equality and freedom with which he is born lead to a general state of war of all against all. Because self-willed people are not fruitful and they will rather look for an opportunity to rob the fruits of other people's labor than to be fruitful themselves. The only solution to avoid total onslaught of everybody against everyone, says Hobbes, is for a self-willed person to renounce his or her God-given freedom and equality by entering into a social contract. According to that contract, the political system guarantees peace and security through its legislative, judicial, and correctional arm, which is there to punish unlawful behavior. The political system of control does all this in the name of the law or justice, but its main method of bringing justice is basically punishment. Justice is used by the political system of control as a tool of control and repression. The principle of love also contains law or justice, but its main method of bringing justice is mercy and investment into a paradigm shift. Peacemakers use justice, but not as a tool of punishment and control, but as a tool of establishing peace. Security and peace are not achieved through condemnation and punishment, but through integration of justice and mercy into a loving investment in transformation of erring people through a paradigm shift. Therefore, the kingdom of God is based on the principles of love and freedom, and the political system of control is based on the principles of fear and security. In order for people to give up a part of their freedom and agree to be controlled by the political system, it is absolutely necessary that they are afraid of something. Without a fear of conflict, it makes no sense for the political system of control to even exist. On the other hand, for people to really become free and live in peace, it is absolutely necessary for love to drive out their fear. And when there is no fear, there is no conflict. Different paradigms are by definition irreconcilable, incommensurable, and mutually exclusive. Different paradigms cannot live in peaceful coexistence. As John Stott famously said, persecution is simply the clash between two irreconcilable value systems. That is the case here as well. The political system of control is tailored for self-willed people, and it is organized around the fear of evil in others. However, the kingdom of God is only for the peacemakers who have achieved personal serenity through the process of integration of vulnerable and dangerous parts of themselves and found a way to be both merciful and righteous. This integration brings about such a transformation that the peacemakers will no longer be afraid of evil in others and will have hope for them, because they saw how that split can be mended. Such a person is no longer self-willed, but lives a life of giving without fear, with an outstretched hand and an open heart, from which justice and mercy flows towards others. The result is a life of freedom and love, both for themselves and for others. The mind and heart that is changed that way will have no problem loving even enemies, because they are not afraid of them. The consequence of this paradigm shift in peacemakers is that peacemakers will now live in a system that have lost its function for them. Systems of control only make sense if you're a self-willed person. However, if you're a peacemaker, there is no longer any need for that kind of control, because you have already integrated righteousness as a principle by which you lead your life. The higher ethics of the kingdom of God frees a peacemaker from the system of control, because his righteousness exceeds the level of governmental idea of justice. Also, peacemakers begin to recognize that the system is rotten from the inside, because it legalizes things that have nothing to do with righteousness. For example, what states allow banks to do all the time to people, or contracts that are harmful to people because it's harmful to the environment, etc., etc. That's all allowed by the states. However, the main problem for the system of control is the absence of fear in peacemakers. When someone is not afraid, then the system lost its power over them. It cannot rule over them, because their power is based on fear. When a system can no longer threaten a person with anything, it becomes redundant along with its employees. The fact that the intelligence agencies turned mobile phones into spying devices is completely in accordance with the principles of fear and security upon which the political system of control rests. In the country where I live, secret police were sending spies to listen to what is preached in churches and try to appoint their recruits to leadership positions. They estimated that the paradigm shift that Jesus is talking about in Beatitudes has the potential to weaken the nationally military prowess, especially the love your enemies claim. Nobody actually knows for sure whether the military prowess would really decrease if a paradigm shift took root in the entire nation. The secret police is fear-based, and fear has big eyes. One of the characteristics of peacemakers is that they stand in defense of justice, and it cannot be said with certainty that they would not defend the weak before the enemy. But the system cannot command these people because love has driven fear out of them. They are no longer motivated by fear, nor do they react to threats. A paradigm shift creates a different kind of citizen. A citizen freed from fear, who is motivated by love, but whom the system of control handles the same way as everyone else, who are still motivated by fear. Jesus has constantly been offered to take over the system of control, to become a king. His birth has been heralded as the coming of the king. Then Satan offered him power in the wilderness. Then the Jews tried to make him a king several times. And finally, the Greeks invited him to go over to them and continue his project over there. And he refused them all. When at one point his followers began to leave him in large numbers, he did not try to stop them. Born to rule, but he consistently rejected to take over the power of the system of control and to indulge the masses. He was the example of a peacemaker, but he did not receive orders from anyone else but his Father. He followed his will and the principles of justice and mercy. In the presence of such a person, the political system becomes nervous because it realizes that it has no power or control over him. According to the Gospels, Jesus was not crucified because the Roman authorities arrested him, but because it was his Father's will to be arrested and to be crucified, and it was his personal choice. Finally, peacemakers are constant reminders of how things really are. In order to be able to control people, the political system needs two things. First, a person or institutions in whose hands are the levers of absolute power, legislature, judiciary, etc. And second, a monopoly over the means of physical coercion, that's weapons, police, army, etc. Without these two things, the system cannot regulate peace among the self-willed population. However, in this arrangement, two categories of citizens emerge. First is those who are controlled and to whom the laws apply, and second, the elites who exercise control, who are making the laws, but to whom the laws do not apply. In his work Statesman, Plato defines statesmen as a category of people without supervisors who sovereignly rule and command others. They are the source of authority for the laws, and they always applied laws to others, never to themselves. However, in the kingdom of God, there is no privileged class that does not have a supervisor. Even if such group of people exist in the kingdom of God, those control systems would be subject to God and His will like everybody else. There is no place for the autonomy and autocracy of the system, but everyone obeys the principles of justice, mutual respect, and love in God's kingdom. Those in whose hands are the levers of the system of control are responsible for the way they use or do not use their power. They are expected to use power for the benefit of others, of those who relinquished their power through the social contract. peacemakers should never be controlled because they are a different kind of citizen who are motivated by love, who answer only and directly to God. This does not mean that the peacemakers are a new class that does not answer to anyone and that human laws do not apply to them, but it means that they are people who, due to a paradigm shift, are guided by a higher ethics. This means that such people will always obey human laws to the extent that they harmonize with God's will, and will violate them when the system uses legislature to legalize injustice, repression, and greed. Peacemakers will always be visible witnesses of this freedom of the kingdom of God. And because this all tastes like God's judgment over those who are used to judging others, and they themselves are never being judged, and since this state of freedom of the peacemakers scares them because they are too liberated for their taste, the system will want to get rid of those people and block the spread of their paradigm, of this paradigm shift. The result is an exile that amounts to taking away the privileges that system of control provides. In the first place, restricting their freedom. We should also bear in mind the fact that this persecution is not the same as the measures that the state applies to criminals. The persecution Jesus is talking about is the kind of persecution that he has experienced. The persecution that was initiated by a system that became afraid that its days might be numbered if the people went through with this paradigm shift. On the other hand, you have intolerable people who invoke control measures on their head because they are immature, self-willed people who could not care less about righteousness and who still need supervisors. Jesus talks about persecution for the sake of righteousness, which the peacemakers integrated into their own personality and integrated this righteousness with mercy. It is the persecution of people who have outgrown the level of justice dictated by the political system, who are free enough to think for themselves and break the unjust laws, and are not afraid of the retaliation. This is not the persecution of beginners who, at the first disagreement, will pretend to be victims and take path of activism. But this is a persecution of non-violent veterans who will bear the consequences of their choice without protest, who will spread around them what they carry inside themselves, and that is peace and friendship. Their willingness to bear suffering and absorb injustice has the potential to inspire all who have come in contact with them. These are people who do not get angry when others reject the new paradigm and retaliate against them with violence. Rather, they are full of some universal optimism, believing that someone from above sees it all, that there is a God who has the last word, the Creator who creates life out of nothing, who revives the dead, who says to the peacemakers, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for the righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Blessed are they because they are punished for choosing a life of freedom and love, because they are not punished for their crimes, but for their righteousness, which is greater than the righteousness of the justice system. Blessed are they because they are punished for not being afraid anymore, for rejecting the violence, and for having no enemies.